I first noticed something was off with Kelly a few weeks ago. It wasn't one big thing but a series of small, subtle changes that began to add up. Kelly had always been diligent and focused on her work, but recently, she seemed more distracted than usual. She started coming home later and later, often with the excuse that she had to work late or attend last-minute meetings. At first, I believed her. I had no reason not to. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Kelly was always a picture of calm and composure. But lately, I could sense a certain restlessness in her. She would often be lost in thought, her gaze distant as if she were somewhere else entirely. I tried to ask her about it, but she brushed off my concerns with a smile, claiming she was just stressed from work. Yet, that didn't fully convince me. There was something more, something she wasn't telling me. It wasn't just her behavior at home that was changing. Kelly had started to take extra care with her appearance, even on days when she didn't have any important meetings. Or so she said. She would spend longer in front of the mirror, choosing her clothes more carefully, and applying makeup with a level of detail that seemed unnecessary for a regular workday. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, convincing myself that I was just overthinking it. But then there were the phone calls. She started receiving more calls than usual, often stepping out of the room to take them in private. When I asked who it was, she would give vague answers, saying it was work-related or just a friend checking in. Her explanations didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, when she mentioned she had a late meeting at the office, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. There was a pit in my stomach, and I needed to know what was going on. I waited until she left, then I followed her. I felt guilty for doing it, but I had to find out the truth. My heart raced as I drove a few cars behind her, careful to keep my distance. Kelly didn't head towards her office like she said she would. Instead, she took a different route, one that led to a part of town we rarely visited. As I followed her, I noticed she was driving more slowly than usual, almost as if she was stalling. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. I parked a little way down the street, out of sight, and watched as she got out of the car. She stood by her car for a moment, adjusting her hair and checking her reflection in the window, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Then, a man approached her, a tall, confident man in an expensive suit. They exchanged a few words, and then he leaned in, placing a hand on her back as they walked into the restaurant together. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I had feared something was wrong, but seeing it confirmed with my own eyes was a punch to the gut. I knew that man. He was Jack, a powerful and influential businessman in the city. Someone I had heard about but never met personally. At that moment, everything became clear. Kelly hadn't been staying late at work. She had been meeting Jack, and I had just caught them together. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion. But above all, there was a burning need to know more, to understand why this was happening. That night, as I watched them from the shadows, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her right away. Instead, I was going to find out everything I could about Jack and his connection to Kelly. If she was going to betray me, I needed to be prepared. And so, the first seeds of suspicion took root, growing into something darker and more determined. I would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. The following days were some of the most difficult I had ever experienced. My suspicions had been confirmed, but the reality of it was still too much to fully grasp. Seeing Kelly with Jack, the way they interacted, the familiarity and intimacy between them, it shattered any illusions I had clung to. I wanted to believe that maybe it was all a misunderstanding, that there was some explanation that would make sense of what I had seen, but deep down, I knew the truth. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was having an affair with another man. It wasn't just the fact that she was cheating on me, it was the way she had gone about it. The secrecy, the lies, the careful planning, it was all so calculated. Kelly was always meticulous in everything she did, and this affair was no different. She had made sure to cover her tracks, to hide the truth from me as long as possible. But now that I knew, the weight of her betrayal pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. Despite the anger boiling inside me, I knew I couldn't afford to lose control. Confronting Kelly right then and there, causing a scene, would only lead to more pain and confusion. I needed to be smart about this. I needed proof, something undeniable that would force her to confront what she had done. So, instead of storming into that restaurant, I stayed in the shadows, watching them from a distance, my mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation. I began following Kelly whenever she left the house, documenting her movements, and tracking every rendezvous she had with Jack. I took photos from afar, recorded conversations whenever I could, and made detailed notes about their meetings. The more I observed, the more it became clear that this was no casual fling. They were deeply involved, and the thought of it made my stomach churn. The hardest part was pretending that everything was normal at home. Kelly would return from her meetings with Jack, slipping back into the role of a loving wife as if nothing was amiss. She would smile at me and ask about my day, and I would have to muster the strength to respond as if I didn't know what she was doing. Every word she spoke felt like another twist of the knife. But I kept my emotions in check, knowing that my time would come. As I gathered more evidence of Kelly's affair, I realized that Jack was not just any man. He was a powerful and influential figure in the business world, with connections that ran deep. But the more I dug into his background, the more I uncovered about his dark past. Jack was not the self-made success story he portrayed himself to be. There were rumors and whispers in the business community of how he had used underhanded tactics to climb to the top. Bribery, blackmail, even ties to organized crime. Jack's empire was built on a foundation of lies and corruption. This discovery shifted my focus. My initial anger towards Kelly began to morph into something else. A burning desire for revenge, not just against her, but against Jack as well. He wasn't just a man who had seduced my wife, he was a predator, someone who had manipulated and ruined countless lives to satisfy his ambitions. The thought of him continuing to live his life unscathed, while I was left to pick up the pieces, was intolerable. I began to formulate a plan, one that would take time and careful execution. I wasn't just going to expose Kelly's infidelity, I was going to destroy Jack's entire world. If he thought he could take what was mine and walk away unscathed, he was gravely mistaken. I would make him pay for everything he had done, not just to me, but to all the people he had hurt along the way. The first step was to gather more information. I hired a private investigator, someone with experience in uncovering the kinds of secrets that powerful men like Jack tried to keep hidden. Together, we began to piece the puzzle of Jack's life, following the money trails, identifying his associates, and uncovering the skeletons in his closet. The deeper we went, the more dirt we found, and it quickly became clear that Jack's entire empire was built on a web of lies, deceit, and criminal activity. But gathering the information was only the beginning. I needed to be strategic in how I used it. If I acted too soon or too rashly, Jack might find a way to wiggle out of it, to cover his tracks or shift the blame onto someone else. I needed to ensure that when I struck, it would be a blow from which he could never recover. I began to quietly reach out to the people Jack had wronged over the years, the former business partners he had betrayed, the employees he had mistreated, the competitors he had crushed. Many of them were more than willing to help, eager to see him brought down. As the pieces of my plan started to come together, I could feel a sense of purpose growing inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. Jack had built his life on the suffering of others, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. As for Kelly, I will deal with her in due time. For now, my focus was on Jack, and ensuring that he would never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt me. The deeper I dug into Jack's past, the clearer it became that he had left a trail of destruction in his wake. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a master manipulator who had used people, ruined lives, and climbed his way to the top on the backs of those he had betrayed. For every success Jack had claimed, there was someone he had deceived or crushed to get there. These were the people I needed on my side. I knew that taking down someone as powerful as Jack couldn't be done alone. I needed allies, people who had a reason to hate him as much as I did. So, I began reaching out, quietly, discreetly. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes or tip my hand too early. The key was to find the right people. Those who had been wronged by Jack but were still close enough to him to have valuable information or influence. I started with a former business partner of Jack's, a man named Robert, who had been one of the earliest casualties of Jack's rise to power. Robert had once been a successful entrepreneur, but Jack had systematically dismantled his company through a hostile takeover, leaving Robert bankrupt and disgraced. He had nothing left to lose, and when I approached him, he was more than eager to help. We met in a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes, and he shared with me everything he knew about Jack's underhanded tactics. He gave me names and dates, and even introduced me to others who had suffered at Jack's hands. Through Robert, I connected with a former employee of Jack's, a woman named Lisa, who had been one of his top executives until she refused to participate in one of his more dubious schemes. Jack had retaliated by blacklisting her in the industry, effectively ending her career. Lisa was bitter and angry, and had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back. She provided me with internal documents, emails, and records that exposed some of Jack's more questionable dealings. These weren't just minor infractions, they were serious, potentially criminal offenses that could bring down his entire empire. Next, I reached out to a competitor Jack had driven out of business through a series of unethical maneuvers. His name was Thomas, and he had once owned a thriving company until Jack used every dirty trick in the book to destroy him. Thomas was now living a modest life, far from the business world, but his hatred for Jack had not diminished. He had kept detailed records of everything that had happened, documents that showed Jack's pattern of behavior over the years. Thomas wasn't interested in money or revenge for its own sake, he just wanted to see Jack pay for what he had done. As I gathered more allies, the network began to grow. Each person I spoke to brought new information, new perspectives, and more pieces of the puzzle. I carefully documented everything, building a case that would be airtight when the time came to reveal it. These people had all been victims of Jack's greed and ambition, and they all shared the same desire to see him fall. They were willing to risk everything, just as I was, to bring him down. But it wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was also about strategy. I needed to coordinate these efforts and ensure that when we struck, it would be with precision and impact. We began holding regular meetings in secret locations, sometimes in the back rooms of quiet restaurants, other times in private homes where we wouldn't be overheard. Each meeting was carefully planned, with communication kept to a minimum to avoid detection. During these meetings, we discussed our next moves. We shared information, compared notes, and refined our approach. It was like planning a military operation. Every detail had to be accounted for. Every potential risk mitigated. Jack was a powerful man with many resources at his disposal, and if he got wind of what we were doing, he would stop at nothing to crush us. But we had an advantage. He didn't know who we were or what we were planning. We were the shadows in the corners of his empire, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to strike. The more we planned, the more confident I became. This wasn't just about me or my revenge anymore, it was about justice. Jack had hurt so many people and ruined so many lives. And now, finally, he was going to face the consequences of his actions. We were going to bring him down, piece by piece, and there would be no escape. As we finalized our plans, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. This was going to work, I could feel it. Jack's time was running out, and he didn't even know it. Soon, the world would see him for what he truly was, and everything he had built would come crashing down. And when that happened, I would be there, watching as the empire he had so ruthlessly constructed crumbled to the ground. Months of meticulous planning, covert meetings, and strategic negotiations had finally brought us to the moment of truth. I had gathered a mountain of evidence against Jack, documents, emails, financial records, testimonies from those he had wronged. Every piece was a thread in the web of deceit, corruption, and crime that Jack had woven over the years. Now, it was time to pull on those threads and watch his empire unravel. I knew that simply exposing Jack's wrongdoings wouldn't be enough. He was too powerful, too well connected. He had built his empire on lies, but he had also built a network of allies who benefited from his success and who might protect him if things went south. To take him down, I needed to strike hard and fast, ensuring that there was no time for damage control or cover-ups. I started by contacting a few key journalists, investigative reporters known for their integrity and their willingness to take on powerful figures. These weren't your average reporters. They were seasoned professionals with a reputation for exposing corruption and bringing down those who thought themselves untouchable. I knew that once they had the story, they wouldn't let go until the truth was out in the open. Our first meeting took place in a small, nondescript cafe, far from the bustling city center. I sat across from a seasoned journalist named Susan, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I handed her a folder, thick with documents, and watched as she carefully leafed through the pages. With every new piece of evidence, her expression grew more serious. She asked pointed questions, probing the depth of the corruption I was exposing. I answered each one, laying out the entire story, from Jack's illegal deals to his manipulation of people and businesses to get what he wanted. Susan agreed to take on the story, but she wasn't the only one. I also contacted another journalist, Mike, who specializes in financial scandals. We met in a quiet park, where I handed over a USB drive containing digital records, bank statements, transaction histories, and communication logs that traced Jack's illicit activities. Mike's eyes lit up as he realized the scope of what he was holding. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a bombshell that could shake the foundations of the business world. Over the next few weeks, Susan, Mike, and their teams began to dig deeper, corroborating the information I had provided with their research. They reached out to the people I had connected them with, former associates of Jack, victims of his schemes, and insiders who were too afraid to speak out until now. Each interview, each new piece of evidence, added to the growing dossier against Jack. Once they had enough to ensure the story was airtight, they prepared to go public. The timing had to be perfect. The articles were set to be published simultaneously across several major news outlets, ensuring that the story would dominate the headlines and flood every news channel and social media platform. The morning of the release, I sat in my living room, staring at my laptop. My heart was pounding, but there was also a sense of calm. This was it, the moment everything would change. I refreshed the news websites, waiting for the stories to go live. And then, it happened. The headlines blazed across the screen: Business Titan exposed, the dark secrets behind Jack Donovan's empire and corruption, crime, and cover-ups, the fall of a corporate giant. The articles were detailed, comprehensive, and damning. They laid out every charge, every piece of evidence, in painstaking detail. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with outrage. Comment sections are filled with people expressing their shock and anger. Hashtags related to Jack and the scandal began trending within hours. News channels picked up the story, broadcasting the revelations to millions of viewers. Analysts and commentators dissected the evidence, discussing the implications for Jack's business, his allies, and the broader industry. The story was everywhere. There was no escaping it. But it didn't stop there. As the public absorbed the news, law enforcement agencies took notice. I had made sure to provide the same evidence to the appropriate authorities, knowing that public pressure would force them to act quickly. Within days, Jack was being investigated for a slew of charges: fraud, embezzlement, bribery, and connections to organized crime. Subpoenas were issued, assets were frozen, and his business operations came under intense scrutiny. Jack, once a figure of untouchable power and influence, found himself at the center of a storm. His allies began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the fallout. Investors pulled out, stocks plummeted, and the board of his company called an emergency meeting to discuss damage control. But it was too late. The scandal had taken on a life of its own, and there was no containing it. The images of Jack being hounded by reporters, his once confident demeanor now replaced with a look of desperation and fear, were plastered across every screen. He tried to deny the allegations at first, calling it a smear campaign, but the evidence was overwhelming. Each new revelation only made things worse, and as the days passed, Jack's world continued to crumble. As I watched the news unfold, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The man who had thought himself invincible was now being brought to his knees. His empire was collapsing, his reputation was in tatters, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Jack Donovan was finished, and the world was finally seeing him for what he truly was. The public reaction to the revelations about Jack Donovan was swift and unforgiving. Within hours of the story breaking, his name became synonymous with corruption, greed, and deceit. The media frenzy that followed was relentless, and Jack quickly became one of the most reviled figures in the business world. The fallout was immediate. His company's stock plummeted, wiping out millions in market value in a matter of days. Investors, fearing further damage, began to pull their money out, and Jack's carefully constructed financial empire started to crumble. The board of directors, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, forced Jack to step down as CEO. His resignation was front-page news, and the image of him leaving his office for the last time, head down and surrounded by security, became an iconic symbol of his fall from grace. But the damage didn't stop there. As the legal investigations ramped up, more of Jack's illicit activities came to light. The authorities seized assets, froze bank accounts, and initiated a series of lawsuits that would tie Jack up in court for years. His vast wealth, once a source of pride and power, was rapidly drained by legal fees, settlements, and the collapse of his business ventures. Jack's former allies, those who had once benefited from his success, were quick to turn their backs on him. In the world of high finance, loyalty is often fleeting, and with Jack no longer able to offer them anything, they abandoned him without hesitation. Business partners, associates, even longtime friends, one by one, they cut ties, leaving Jack isolated and alone. The man who had once commanded respect and fear was now treated like a pariah. The social scene that had once embraced him closed its doors. Invitations to exclusive events and gatherings dried up. Jack, who had once been a fixture at elite parties and high-profile gatherings, found himself uninvited, unwelcome, and ignored. His name, once mentioned with admiration, was now a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. As the weeks turned into months, Jack's life became a shadow of what it had been. His luxurious lifestyle was unsustainable without the income and influence he had once wielded. Properties were sold off to cover debts, and the lavish homes, cars, and private jets that had once symbolized his success were gone. Jack, once a titan of industry, was now struggling to maintain even a semblance of his former life. The final blow came when he was blacklisted from the business community. No one would hire him, and no company wanted to be associated with him. His reputation was in ruins, and any hope of rebuilding his career was dashed. Jack Donovan had become a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when ambition and greed are left unchecked. For Jack, the worst part wasn't the loss of wealth or status, it was the complete and utter rejection by the world he had once dominated. The man who had built an empire, who had controlled vast resources and influenced countless lives, was now an outcast. His fall from grace was complete, and there was no coming back from it. As I watched the aftermath unfold, I knew that justice had been served. Jack had paid the price for his actions, and the world had seen him for what he truly was. The man who had once seemed invincible had been brought low, and there was a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that his downfall had been as spectacular as his rise. In the days following Jack's downfall, Kelly's demeanor changed dramatically. Gone was the confident, self-assured woman who had once looked at me with indifference, and in her place was someone entirely different, anxious, remorseful, and visibly broken. The magnitude of what she had done, and the consequences of her actions, were becoming painfully clear to her. At first, she tried to hide her emotions, maintaining a fragile facade of normalcy. But as the reality of Jack's ruin settled in, Kelly's mask began to crack. I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way her voice trembled when she spoke to me, and in the way she would catch herself staring into space, lost in thoughts she didn't dare to share. It was as if she was coming to terms with the fact that the man she had chosen over her husband had been exposed as a fraud, a criminal, and worse, a complete failure. One evening, after days of strained silence, Kelly finally broke down. I found her sitting on the edge of our bed, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs. It was the first time I had seen her cry like this in years, and despite everything, a part of me still felt a pang of empathy. But I reminded myself of the betrayal, of the countless nights I had spent tormented by the knowledge of her affair, and any sympathy I felt quickly faded. "Alec," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I made a terrible mistake. I was so wrong, about everything." She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy from crying, searching my face for some sign of forgiveness. I thought I wanted something more, something different, but I didn't realize what I was losing in the process. "I've lost everything that matters. I've lost you." There was a time when those words might have softened my heart, but that time had passed. I stood there, unmoved, as she continued to plead her case. "I was stupid, Alec. I got caught up in something that wasn't real. I see that now. Jack, he wasn't who I thought he was. He used me, just like he used everyone else. And I let him." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice breaking. "I've been so blind, and I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. But please, Alec, I'm begging you. Can we try to fix this? Can we start over? I still love you. I never stopped loving you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and regret. She moved closer to me, reaching out to take my hand, but I pulled away. I could see the pain in her eyes. The realization that her pleas were falling on deaf ears, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Kelly, I began, my voice calm but firm, it's too late. I gave you everything, my trust, my love, my commitment, and you threw it away for a fantasy. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed us, everything we built together. And now, when the fantasy has crumbled, you want to come back as if nothing happened? You expect me to just forget what you did? She shook her head, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. No, Alec, I don't expect that. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I've realized what matters, and it's not the money or the excitement or the thrill, it's you. It's always been you. Her words, though heartfelt, felt hollow to me. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. I had already made up my mind, and no amount of tears or apologies could change that. I can't do this, Kelly, I said quietly, looking her straight in the eyes. You made your choice, and I've made mine. I'm moving on, with or without you. Her face crumpled as the full weight of my words hit her. She collapsed onto the bed, sobbing uncontrollably, but I didn't move to comfort her. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of closure. The pain of her betrayal had once consumed me, but now, seeing her so broken and desperate, I realized that I was free. Free from the doubt, the anger, and the hurt. Free to rebuild my life on my terms, without the shadow of her infidelity hanging over me. Kelly had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. As for me, I was done looking back. The future awaited, and I was ready to face it alone. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, Kelly's betrayal, Jack's downfall, and the emotional turmoil I'd endured, I found myself at a crossroads. The temptation to dwell on the past, to let anger and bitterness consume me, was strong. But as the dust began to settle, I realized that continuing down that path would only keep me chained to the pain and betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. I needed to move forward, rebuild my life from the ground up, and reclaim the dignity that had been stripped away during this whole ordeal. The first step was to focus on my career. For too long, I had allowed my personal life to overshadow my professional ambitions. The energy I had once poured into my work had been diverted into trying to maintain a crumbling marriage. But now, with that chapter of my life closed, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I threw myself into my work, not as a distraction, but as a means of rediscovering the passion and drive that had once defined me. I started by taking on new projects, ones that challenged me and pushed me out of my comfort zone. I worked long hours, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like progress, like I was building something meaningful again. My efforts didn't go unnoticed. I began to receive recognition from my peers, and my career started to climb to new heights. With each success, I felt a piece of my confidence return, and with it, a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in years. But my new beginning wasn't just about work. I knew that if I wanted to truly move on, I needed to reclaim my life outside of the office as well. I had always had a passion for photography, a hobby I'd neglected during the turbulent years of my marriage. So, I dusted off my old camera and started taking it with me wherever I went. What began as a way to clear my mind soon became a creative outlet that brought me immense joy. I would spend weekends exploring the city, capturing moments of beauty and stillness that reminded me of the simplicity and peace I had been missing. In reconnecting with my hobbies, I also reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage. At first, it was difficult to open up, to admit how far I had fallen, but I found that my friends were more supportive than I had expected. They welcomed me back with open arms, and soon, I was surrounded by a community of people who genuinely cared about me. We started meeting regularly, going on hikes, having dinners, and even taking short trips together. These moments of camaraderie and laughter were a balm to my wounded soul. Slowly, I began to build a new life for myself, one that was rich with purpose, creativity, and connection. I learned to find joy in the small things: an early morning jog, the sound of waves crashing on the shore, a well-made cup of coffee. These simple pleasures, which I had once taken for granted, became the foundation of my new beginning. I also started therapy, something I had resisted for a long time. It wasn't easy to confront the emotions I had buried deep inside, the anger, the sadness, the feeling of betrayal. But with the help of a compassionate therapist, I began to work through these feelings, to understand them, and eventually, to let them go. Therapy taught me to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made, to accept what had happened without letting it define me, and to look forward to the future with hope rather than fear. As the months passed, I noticed a change in myself. I no longer felt the need to look over my shoulder, to question every decision I made. The doubts and insecurities that had plagued me for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that I had thought was lost forever. I realized that I was not defined by my past, but by the choices I made in the present. There were moments of loneliness, of course. There were times when I would think about what could have been, about the life I had envisioned with Kelly before everything fell apart. But these moments grew less frequent, and when they did come, they no longer held the power to bring me down. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far I had come and how much I had grown. In time, I began to think about the possibility of finding love again. I knew I wasn't ready yet, but the idea no longer filled me with dread. Instead, it felt like a new adventure, one that I could approach with the wisdom and experience I had gained from my past. I had learned the importance of self-respect, of communication, and of choosing someone who valued me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. My new life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. I had rebuilt my career, rediscovered my passions, and surrounded myself with people who cared about me. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth and dignity. I was no longer the man who had been betrayed and broken. I was the man who had risen from the ashes of his old life to create something new, something better. As I stood on the threshold of this new beginning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty didn't scare me. Instead, it excited me. The road ahead was mine to walk, and I was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. In the end, forgiveness came easier than I had expected, but forgetting was another matter entirely. Over time, the anger and resentment I had harbored toward Kelly began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding of her flaws and my own. I could see now that our marriage had been unraveling long before Jack ever entered the picture. The affair had been a symptom, not the cause, of the deep cracks that had formed between us. Kelly's betrayal had wounded me deeply, but it had also forced me to confront the truth about our relationship. We had grown apart, drifting so far from each other that reconciliation was impossible. Even as I forgave her, I knew that the bond we once shared had been irreparably broken. No amount of apologies or tears could change that. One evening, after months of reflection and soul-searching, I sat down with Kelly for what would be our final conversation as husband and wife. We had been living separate lives under the same roof, and it was clear to both of us that this arrangement couldn't continue. The time had come to face the reality of our situation. "I forgive you, Kelly," I said quietly, looking her in the eyes. "I don't want to carry this anger with me any longer. It's done nothing but weigh me down, and I'm ready to let it go." She nodded, her eyes welling with tears, but this time, there were no desperate pleas for a second chance. She had come to her realization, just as I had. "I'm sorry, Alec," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I understand now that we can't go back. Too much has happened." We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us grappling with the finality of what we were saying. There was a sadness in the air, a mourning for what could have been, but also a sense of relief. The weight of the past was lifting, making way for something new. "We need to move on," I continued, my voice steady. "We both deserve a chance to find happiness again, but that's not going to happen if we keep clinging to what's already gone. Our marriage, it's over, Kelly. And that's okay." She didn't argue. Instead, she simply nodded, a few tears slipping down her cheeks as she accepted the truth we had both known for some time. We spoke for a while longer, discussing the logistics of our separation, but the most important part of the conversation had already happened. We had both acknowledged that our paths were diverging, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The decision to end our marriage, to finally say goodbye to the past, was difficult, but it was also liberating. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. The anger, the pain, the resentment, they were all fading into the background, replaced by a quiet determination to build something new for me. I began the process of finalizing our divorce, and while there were moments of sadness, there was also a growing sense of closure. I knew I was making the right decision. This chapter of my life was ending. But a new one was beginning, and I was ready to embrace it. As I packed up the remnants of our shared life, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The love that Kelly and I had once shared was real, but it was also flawed. We had tried to build a life together, but somewhere along the way, we had lost sight of what truly mattered. In the end, it wasn't the affair that destroyed our marriage. It was the slow erosion of trust, communication, and connection. But I wasn't bitter. If anything, I felt grateful for the lessons I had learned. The experience taught me the importance of honesty, staying true to oneself, and letting go when something no longer serves you. It has shown me that sometimes the most difficult decisions are the ones that lead to the greatest growth. With the papers signed and the final details settled, I stood at the threshold of a new beginning. The past was behind me, a closed chapter in a book that I had no desire to reopen. I had forgiven Kelly, but more importantly, I had forgiven myself. I was ready to move forward, unburdened by the weight of what had been, and eager to discover what the future held. As I walked away from the life I had once known, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The past was a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was free to write the next chapter of my story, and I knew, deep down, that it would be a story of resilience, renewal, and hope. This was the end of one journey, but the beginning of another, and I was ready to face it with an open heart and a clear mind. The future was mine to shape, and I intended to make the most of it.